In the summer of 1888, a young man with an Irish face and a worn leather notebook walked into the Great Smoky Mountains of western North Carolina, into a country that most of America had spent the previous 50 years trying to forget existed. His name was James Mooney. He was 27 years old, almost wholly self-taught, and he worked out of a small office inside the Smithsonian called the Bureau of Ethnology. He had come to live among the eastern band of the Cherokee, the families who had hidden in these mountains rather than be marched west. And over the next few seasons, sitting in smoky cabins and beside slow rivers, he wrote down something that has quietly unsettled people ever since. The Cherokee told him that the great earthen structures scattered across their homeland, some of them taller than a house and older than anyone's memory, had not been built by their ancestors. They said they had only kept them. They said the mounds had already been standing when the Cherokee arrived. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. And they said that deep inside the largest of them, a fire was still burning. A fire that they insisted had never once gone out. This is not a story about a lost civilization of giants, or some erased empire that history conveniently buried. It is something stranger than that, because every piece of it is real. It was written down by a real man, from the mouths of real people, in the years around 1888, and you can still read his notebooks today. This is the story of what the Cherokee actually said about the structures that stood before them, and about the everlasting fire they swore was still alive, somewhere underground, waiting. To understand why any of this survived, you have to understand the silence Mooney walked into. 50 years earlier, in the winter of 1838, the United States government had rounded up the Cherokee Nation at Bayonet Point and driven them west toward Oklahoma along a route that became known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands died on that road. Old people, children, whole families, dead of cold and hunger and disease in a forced march of more than 1,000 miles. Mooney would later interview the survivors of that march, the ones still alive in the 1890s, and he called what they described the cruelest work he ever knew. He understood, better than almost any white man of his time, exactly what had been done to these people. But a few hundred Cherokee had refused to go. They scattered into the high coves of the Smokies, living quietly, hiding from soldiers, surviving in a homeland that was being carved up and sold off around them. Over the following decades, through a strange and difficult legal arrangement, they slowly bought back small pieces of their own mountains and held on. Their grandchildren were the people Mooney came to meet, clinging to a remnant of land in the place their ancestors had lived for centuries. And by the 1880s, the fear was that the old knowledge was dying with them. The language, the medicine, the prayers, the names of the rivers, the stories of where the mounds came from. An entire world held only in the memory of a handful of aging men, with no guarantee any of it would reach the next generation. Mooney himself wrote that the forced removal had done more to destroy Cherokee tradition than any other single event in their history. He had arrived, in a very real sense, at the last possible moment to write it down. He did not come to convert them, or to teach them, or to take anything from them. He came to listen, and to record it before it was gone. That distinction mattered enormously. It was the reason doors opened to him that had stayed shut to everyone else who came up those mountains, and the most important door of all belonged to a man named Swimmer. In Cherokee, his name was Ayunini. He was an older man, a medicine keeper, a storyteller, and one of the last people alive who carried the full weight of the old tradition in his head. Most outsiders looked at him and saw a poor man in a remote mountain settlement. Mooney looked at him and saw something closer to a living library. Swimmer could recite sacred formulas for healing, recount myths that reach back centuries, and explain the meaning of places and ceremonies that almost everyone else had stopped asking about. The two of them spent long hours together, season after season, and slowly, carefully, Swimmer began to share what he knew. Some of it Swimmer had even written down himself. And this is a detail that genuinely surprises people. The Cherokee had their own written script, and not one borrowed from Europeans. It was invented earlier in the century by a single man named Sequoyah, who could not read English and had no formal education, and who, working almost entirely alone, built a complete writing system for his language out of nothing. He gave each syllable of spoken Cherokee its own symbol. It is one of the only times in all of recorded history that a person from a non-literate culture sat down and single-handedly created a functioning script from scratch. Within a few years of its invention, the Cherokee Nation had a higher literacy rate than many of the white settlements around it. They printed their own newspaper in it, and a few of the medicine keepers had quietly used that script for something else entirely. They wrote their most sacred material into private notebooks in the Cherokee syllabary, where no outsider could read it. These were not made for show. They were working manuals of prayer and healing, written by the men who used them for their own eyes. When Swimmer eventually trusted Mooney enough to let him see his, it became one of the most extraordinary documents in the entire record of Native America. A book of spells and medicine, in a language written down by the people who spoke it, handed across to a stranger at the exact moment that world was disappearing. Mooney gathered these into a study he published in 1891 called The Sacred Formulas of the Cherokees. And the word in that title that matters most for our story is healing. Because the Cherokee world Mooney was documenting was, at its very heart, a world organized around medicine. Not medicine the way we mean it now, a pill and a prescription and a waiting room. Medicine as a relationship between a person, the spirit world, the plants, the animals, the rivers, and the words you spoke to bind them all together. A formula for a fever was not just a list of herbs to boil. It was a chant, a precise sequence, a story told directly to the sickness itself to argue it out of the body. The Cherokee treated disease as something almost alive, often sent by the spirits of animals that humans had wronged, and the healer's job was to know the exact words, in the exact order, addressed to the exact power that could undo it. Get the formula wrong, and it did nothing at all. Get it right, and, they believed, you could turn back almost anything. There were formulas for far more than sickness. There were formulas for love, for success in hunting, for protection in war, for winning at the ball game, for calling rain onto the crops. The whole of life had words attached to it. Mooney was uneasy, at times, about publishing material this sacred, and he said so openly. He knew that some of the people who shared it with him did so reluctantly, and that putting it into a government report stripped it out of the hands of the men it belonged to. He published it anyway, convinced it was the only way to keep it from vanishing completely. People still argue about whether he was right to, but the center of all that healing, underneath the herbs and the formulas, was water. The Cherokee called the river the Long Man, a giant who stretched from the mountains down to the sea, his head up in the high country and his feet in the lowlands, forever speaking in a voice that only the medicine keepers could truly understand. Going to water was one of the oldest and most important rituals they had. Before dawn, at the turning of the seasons, before a hunt, before a ball game, before almost anything that carried weight, you went down to the river, and you stepped into the cold running current, while the priest spoke the words over you. It cleansed you. It renewed you. It carried away sickness and grief and bad fortune downstream and let you begin again, clean. This is the real healing tradition that sat at the foundation of Cherokee life. Not a machine, not a buried technology, but something arguably more durable than either. A way of treating the land itself as alive, as a partner you were in conversation with, as a source of real power you could draw on if you only knew how to ask. And it was tied, directly and physically, to the places they considered most sacred of all. Which brings us back to the mounds. If you drive into Franklin, North Carolina today, you will pass an enormous grassy hill sitting incongruously in the middle of town, surrounded by streets and parking lots and ordinary buildings. Almost no one who passes it has any idea what they are looking at. It is called the Nikwasi Mound, and it is at least 1,000 years old. It may be a great deal older than that, and it has never been excavated. Not once, not ever. In a country that has dug up and catalogued almost everything, this single mound has kept its secrets for 10 full centuries. Mooney described the mounds carefully, because the Cherokee explained them carefully. They were always built on level ground, on the rich flat bottomlands beside a river, in the exact spots where people could gather to dance, to play the ball game, and to go to water. They were not random heaps of soil. According to what the Cherokee told Mooney, the earth had been carried and stacked one basketful at a time, by hand, by the women of the community, in a deliberate act of construction that would have taken years of labor. Inside, at the very base, the builders had buried the bodies of revered leaders and sacred objects, and they had set a hollow cedar log upright in the center. And inside that protected log, shielded from the crushing weight of the earth above, they kept a fire. Not an ordinary cooking fire, the everlasting fire, the sacred flame of the town which was never ever allowed to die. Once a year, at the great green corn ceremony that marked the new year, every single household in the settlement put out its own hearth, swept it clean, and then relit it from this one central fire, so that the entire community began the year sharing a single flame. It was the literal heart of the town, kept burning in the literal heart of the mound. There is a deeper pattern hidden inside that fire, too. The Cherokee were organized into 7 clans, and the number 7 ran through nearly everything they did. There were 7 directions in their understanding of the world, the 4 around you, plus the 1 above, the 1 below, and the still center where you stand. Their great ceremonies ran in cycles of 7. And the townhouse raised on top of the mound was traditionally built with 7 sides, 1 for each clan, so that the whole nation had a place at the same fire. Mooney recorded that some said the mounds themselves were raised over the remains of honored leaders drawn from each of the 7 clans, the people buried beneath the very floor where their descendants would later gather. The structure was not just a building on a hill. It was the entire society, mapped into earth and timber and flame, and here is where Swimmer told Mooney something that genuinely stops you in your tracks. He said the everlasting fire was strongest in the largest and oldest mounds, at sacred centers like Nikwasi and a place called Kittua, and he said that the fire was still burning, still down there, at the bottom of those great mounds, long after the towns above them had been burned and abandoned. As proof, Swimmer pointed to something that had happened within living memory. During the Civil War, he said, Cherokee soldiers camped near the old mound at Kittua had seen smoke still rising out of it. Smoke, from a fire no living person had tended in generations, seeping up through 1,000 years of packed earth. That place, Kittua, deserves its own moment, because to the Cherokee it was not just another mound, it was the mother town. The oldest settlement, the first fire, the place the whole nation traced itself back to. The Cherokee called themselves the Ani-Kittuagi, the people of Kittua, a name taken directly from that mound. Some of them spoke of it as the center of the earth itself. When Swimmer said the fire still burned hottest there, he was not pointing at a ruin. He was pointing at the origin point of his entire people, and telling Mooney that it was, in some sense, still alive. Now, notice carefully what the Cherokee were actually claiming through all of this. They were not saying their grandfathers built these structures. They were openly, repeatedly, consistently telling Mooney the exact opposite. The mounds were already old when the Cherokee came to live among them. They had inherited them. They maintained them, used them, raised their council houses on top of them, and wrapped their most sacred ceremonies around them. But the original builders, the people who first stacked that earth and lit that first fire, belonged to a time before. And that raises the question Mooney himself could never fully answer. Before what? And built by whom? To the Cherokee, the answer was not a mystery at all. The mounds belonged to the Nunahi. The Nunahi, in the Cherokee language, means something close to the people who live anywhere. They were also called the Immortals. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment now, then come back. the ones who live forever. And according to everything Swimmer and the other elders told Mooney, they were not ghosts, and they were not gods, and they were not the spirits of the dead. They were a separate race of spirit people who had always lived in these mountains, in hidden townhouses inside the high bald peaks where no timber grows, and, most importantly, underneath the mounds. The Cherokee described them as looking and speaking exactly like ordinary people whenever they chose to show themselves. The rest of the time, they were simply invisible. They loved music and dancing above all else, and hunters in the mountains would sometimes hear drumming and singing coming from inside a peak, but when they walked toward the sound, it would slide away from them, always staying just out of reach, behind them, off in another direction, so they could never find the dance. The Nunahi were generally kind. They guided lost travelers safely home. They took the freezing and the starving into their warm hidden houses, fed them, let them rest, and showed them the way back. And in times of real danger, they came out to fight. There was a quieter story too, about 4 Nunahi women who came to a dance at a town on the Nunahi River and danced with the young men there for hours. Nobody suspected a thing. Everyone assumed they were simply women visiting from another village. But as they left, some of the men outside watched them walk down the open trail toward the river, and when the women reached the water's edge, they vanished into thin air, with nowhere to hide. Only then did the men understand who had been dancing among them all night. But the most famous of these stories is the one Swimmer told Mooney about the mound at Nikwasi itself, the same grassy hill that sits in Franklin today. Long ago, the story goes, a powerful and unknown enemy came up out of the southeast, destroying town after town as it pushed deeper into the mountains. When it reached Nikwasi, the warriors of the town gathered their families into the townhouse on top of the mound and went out to meet the attackers at dawn. They fought hard, but they were being overwhelmed, and slowly they began to fall back toward the mound. And then a stranger appeared among them. He told the chief to call off his men and said that he alone would drive the enemy back. The Cherokee assumed he was a chief from one of the other towns, arrived with reinforcements. As they retreated past the base of the mound, they saw something no one there had ever seen. A great company of armed warriors came pouring out of the side of the mound, as though through an open doorway in the earth itself. And the people of Nikwasi understood in that instant who their defenders were. The Nunahi had come up out of the mound by the hundreds, painted and ready for battle. Once they were outside, they turned invisible. The enemy could see the arrows flying and feel the blows landing, but could not see a single warrior striking them. They broke and ran. And when the fighting was finished, the immortals went back into the side of the mound and closed it behind them. It is, on its surface, a legend, but sit for a moment with what it actually says. The Cherokee did not describe the mound as a tomb, or a monument, or a pile of old dirt. They described it as a doorway, a threshold between this world and another one, with a living population on the far side of it who would, on the right day, step through into ours. The mound was not where something had been. It was where something still was. These stories were woven all through the landscape Mooney mapped. There was a hole on a branch of the Nunahi River, near Blood Mountain, that breathed warm vapour up out of the ground in the dead of winter, heating all the air around it. The Cherokee said that was because the Nunahi had a townhouse and a fire burning underneath the mountain, and cold hunters would stop there to warm themselves, though they were always afraid to linger too long. There was a circular depression near the old town of Tougaloo, always swept perfectly clean by unseen hands, that would throw back out anything a passing traveller tossed into it. The Cherokee also spoke of another group entirely, separate from the immortals. They called them the Yunwi Sunsdi, the little people, small spirit folk no taller than a child who lived among the rocks and the laurel thickets. They could be helpful or they could be dangerous, and there were strict rules about how you behaved if you ever crossed their path. The mountains, in the Cherokee understanding, were simply crowded with other kinds of people. The visible world was only the surface of a far busier one. And there was the strangest story of all, the one about how a particular mound came to exist in the first place. The Cherokee said that long before the removal, the Nunahi told the people of one town that they would return in 7 days and carry the entire townhouse away, with everyone still inside it, to keep them safe forever. They gave a single instruction: No matter what happened, stay completely silent. On the seventh day, a sound like rolling thunder came across the land, growing louder and louder, and the ground began to shake as the townhouse was lifted up off the earth. But some of the people inside grew frightened and cried out. Startled by the scream, the Nunahi carrying one end of the townhouse let it slip, and that broken piece fell back to the ground. And where it landed, the Cherokee said, it became the mound at a village called Setsi. The rest of the townhouse, with the silent people still inside, was carried off to a distant mountain peak and turned to solid rock, and the people within it became immortal and invisible. The Cherokee were, in other words, telling Mooney that the mounds were dropped pieces of a spirit world, that the structures standing in their valleys were the visible edges of something vast and hidden that had been here long before them and was here still. Now, Mooney was a careful man, and a man of his era, and it is worth being honest about both. He worked for a bureau whose director believed in the racial ideologies of the 19th century, the idea that human cultures climbed a fixed ladder from savagery up to civilization. Mooney did not share the cruelty of that worldview. He treated the Cherokee with a respect almost unheard of among his colleagues. He learned the language. He sat at their fires for years. Later in his life, he would even risk his whole career defending native religious practices the government wanted banned, and he paid for it with the scorn of his own profession. But he was still writing these tales down as folklore, as myth, and he was honest about that. He never claimed the Nunahi were literally real. As he put it, the literal truth of the stories was never questioned by the people who told them, but it was never quite vouched for either. He simply recorded what they said, as faithfully as he possibly could, and let it stand on its own. And what modern archaeology has uncovered, in the century since, is its own kind of remarkable. The mounds of the southeast were not built by the Cherokee. On this exact point, the science and the Cherokee themselves are in complete agreement. They were raised by an earlier and far larger civilization that archaeologists now call the Mississippians, who flourished across the river valleys of the American Southeast and Midwest, beginning around the year 1000. They built enormous earthwork cities. Their greatest center, near what is now St. Louis, held tens of thousands of people at its peak, larger at one point than London. They sustained huge populations, ran trade networks across half a continent, raised mounds the size of pyramids, and then, for reasons still argued over by archaeologists today, declined and scattered, and came apart before any European ever arrived to write a word of it down. The Cherokee moved into a landscape already covered in the silent monuments of a people who were gone. They were not lying to Mooney, and they were not confused. They were telling the literal truth as they had inherited it. We did not build these. They were here before us. What actually happened to those builders is one of the real open questions of American archaeology. Their great cities did not fall to a single war or a single plague that anyone can point to. Sometime in the few centuries before Europeans arrived, the largest centers emptied out. Whole regions that had once held dense populations were simply abandoned, left so quiet that archaeologists have a name for the void they left behind. The reasons are still debated. Shifting climate, exhausted soil, war, political collapse, some combination of all of it. By the time the Cherokee were living among the mounds, the builders were already a memory wrapped in story. Which means the Cherokee were doing, in their own way, exactly what we are doing right now. Standing in front of a structure left by a vanished people, and trying to explain who they were. So stand at the base of the Nikwasi mound, and let that fully settle. 1,000 years ago, a civilization we still only partly understand stacked that earth basket by basket, lit a fire at its heart, and then vanished from history. Centuries later, the Cherokee arrived, recognized it as sacred, and kept the fire alive, ceremony by ceremony, generation after generation, through war and disease, and finally through the catastrophe of the removal itself, and it has never been dug into. The single largest unexcavated mound in the entire southeast is sitting quietly in a small Carolina town, and whatever is at the bottom of it, the everlasting fire, the cedar log, the graves of forgotten leaders, the answer to who built it, is all still down there, exactly where the builders left it 1,000 years ago. Mooney actually tried to change that. In 1889, he asked the Bureau for permission to have its archaeologists excavate Nikwasi as part of a great national mound survey. The request went nowhere. A government archaeologist who catalogued the mound described it as one of the largest and best preserved in the state, and then wrote one single word beside its entry: unopened, and so it stayed. There is something almost fitting in that. Of all the mounds in the region, the one wrapped most tightly in stories of an everlasting fire and a hidden people living inside it is the one that no one ever cut open. The mound carries a darker irony too. In 1761, during the colonial wars, British forces burned the town of Nikwasi to the ground and used the townhouse on top of the sacred mound as a field hospital for their wounded soldiers. The place the Cherokee had built their whole tradition of healing around was turned, for a season, into a place of healing for the very army destroying them. The Long Man, the everlasting fire, the going to water, and then a colonial surgery on top of it all. The world Mooney was racing against did close in, the way everyone had feared. The Cherokee language kept eroding. The allotment policies of the era kept chewing away at the land. Swimmer, the medicine keeper who had carried so much of it, grew old and died not many years after he and Mooney finished their work together. When men like him passed, they took with them prayers and stories that had never been written down by anyone but themselves. If Mooney had arrived a single generation later, much of what we now know would simply not exist. There would be no record of the Long Man, no spirit defenders of Nikwasi, no everlasting fire, no Nunahi. Just unmarked grassy hills and a silence no one alive could read. But he did arrive in time. And because one careful outsider was willing to sit and listen, and one old medicine man named Swimmer decided, against every reason not to, that this knowledge was worth saving, even in the hands of a stranger, it survived. Mooney wrote, near the end of his work, that the Cherokee had changed in their dress and their outward seeming, but that the heart of the people was still their own. The notebooks he filled in those mountains in the years around 1888 are still kept in the Smithsonian. The sacred formulas and the myths of the Cherokee are still in print, still read, still studied, including by the descendants of the very people who first spoke those words to him. And the mound still stands. In 2019, after years of dispute over who should care for it, the Nikwasi Mound was placed back under the stewardship of an organization built around the Cherokee themselves, and the long process of returning it fully to Cherokee hands began in earnest. The fire at its heart, whatever it ever truly was, has now outlasted the empire that built it, the nation that inherited it, and the government that tried to erase them both. 1,000 years on, the people who never once claimed to have built that mound are, again, its keepers. So when you hear about the structures that stood before, the impossibly old buildings, the hidden knowledge that supposedly got buried and erased, remember that there is a true version of that story, and it is better than any of the invented ones. There really were monumental structures raised by a vanished people. There really was a living tradition of healing wrapped all the way around them. The Cherokee really did say, in the years around 1888, that a fire still burned at the bottom of the mounds, and they pointed to smoke seen rising during the Civil War as their proof. None of it had to be made up. It was simply written down by a man who was willing to sit still and listen, and who believed that what these people knew was worth saving before it disappeared from the earth. The longing behind every lost world theory is a real one. We want the past to have been grander and stranger than we were told, but the Cherokee answer to that longing was never a fantasy bolted on after the fact. It was a fire they tended for 1,000 years, and a promise that someone was still keeping it lit. The everlasting fire is still down there, under the grass, in a small town in the mountains. In more than 1,000 years, no one has ever gone down to look, and maybe that is exactly as it should be.